Hello and welcome to another episode of the FemiNinja Project. And thank you so much for tuning in. I really appreciate it. As always, I have a fantastic guest with me today. His name is Cory Rosenke. He is an author, theologian, pastor, teacher, and coach who spent most of his childhood in the debilitating grip of poverty, isolation, and even homelessness. He found his reprieve by exploring the majestic but lonely mountain slopes of the Rocky Mountains, along with a walking stick, a book, and his faithful dog. His curious mind was always asking why, especially in regards to human nature. He has been a cowboy, a carpenter, a business owner, small town pastor, a seminary graduate, and a multinational teacher. His recently published book is titled The Magnetic Heart of God: Understanding the Five Cravings of Your Soul. Oh my God, that gave me chills. Today, Cory remains as inquisitive as ever and spends his days as he always has, reading, writing, exploring, shepherding, and forever watching and wondering. Cory, thank you so much for being here and welcome to the show.
Cheryl, what a great introduction. I am delighted to be here. Thank you so much.
Oh, it's an honor to have you. You have such an amazing story and even just the way that you grew up. I mean, to me that it's so sad, but the way that you were able to I don't want to say entertain yourself, but just your natural curiosity
Mm.
of everything around you, of nature and of human nature is truly amazing.
Yeah. I feel blessed by it. It's one of those things where, as you mentioned, there's a tragic element to it.
Hmm.
And I have to admit that as I grew into a young man, I had a lot of baggage that I didn't realize I had.
Hmm.
Um, and so I had to work through that over the years. But at the same time, I'm thankful because even though I grew up in, somewhat unusual, even at times grim circumstances,
Hmm.
somehow or in some way, um, my coping mechanisms weren't self-destructive. And there are a lot of people out here there who aren't as blessed as I was in that regard, and their path was more self-destructive, whereas I felt like mine was an enlightening journey as hard as it was. And so I feel very blessed and thankful for it.
Mhm. And one of the things that I mean, your bio is so fascinating, and of course, I didn't want to go into all the details, but one of the things we talk about, walking the Rocky Mountains, I can't imagine. I mean, of course, it was lonely, but the peacefulness that you must have felt in the mountains, but also that you always had a book with you. And when people think, especially as a young boy, with the type of books that you would read or that you would like, you definitely did not fit that traditional mold. Let's just put
Yeah.
it that way.
Yeah, I was a strange boy and didn't realize how strange until now. So, as an example, you can see, I have very blonde hair. I'm a Norwegian descent.
Mm.
And yet in school, what the kids called me was the Indian. That was the name because I grew up on a mountainside. I wore moccasins and leather, and so that was the way they visually represented me. And so, but I was this boy who just, as you mentioned, wandered the slopes, just drinking in, I mean, the
Mm.
majesty and the awesomeness of nature and sky and stone and rushing water and just wandered those mountains alone. And oftentimes I think back, I would disappear for sometimes days on end into the forest, and how my parents let that happen or accepted that. I don't know. Looking back, I don't judge them, but I'm like, oh, I wouldn't let my kid do that today. Um, but I had such amazing experiences, and as I mentioned with my books, and I remember being really young and going to church one time, and the someone in church hearing that I loved to read, and so they're like, "Oh, you should read C.S. Lewis." And looking back on it, I think they were talking about the Chronicles of Narnia. I should read the Chronicles of Narnia. But I didn't hear that. So I was reading The Problem of Pain and The Great Divorce, and his philosophical works, right? And of course, then I was super into at that particular time Plato and Aristotle, and Marcus Aurelius was a favorite philosopher of mine. And so yeah, a very young boy who they call the Indian, wearing moccasins in the mountain, reading Plato alone in the forest. It was definitely a unique upbringing.
Amen to that. I mean, that's just incredible. So your parents never really worried when you would disappear for days? They just knew that you knew your way around the mountains and you'd make it home okay?
Yeah, apparently, I mean, I don't know if they worried or not, but they let me go, and I always
Mm.
came back.
Wow. Did you have any siblings?
I did. I had an older brother and an older sister, and my older brother moved out quite young as well, and my sister wasn't quite the wandering spirit I was. She stuck a little closer to home, so definitely, we had very different experiences.
Mhm. Wow. I would worry more about the wild animals, I think, than anything
Yeah,
else.
yeah. Well, there was, I mean, I have so many experiences with cougars and bears and wolves, and I think what one of the things that kind of made me, think of those experiences that shape you and you don't even really quite understand why.
Mhm.
But I remember one time finding this lake up in the mountain, this small lake, and in the dead of winter, this is British Columbia, Canada, so it's, -20, -30, like it's real winter,
Mhm.
right? 4 feet of snow. And I remember having gone down to the lake, hiked out there one time and seen these wolf tracks that were all around the lake. And I remember thinking, I want to see them at night. And so I remember going down there at night in the dark, and there was a kind of a cliff on the edge of the lake, and just kind of climbing up there, like an army crawl to the edge of the cliff, and just sitting there in the silence of that remote wilderness silence, and seeing a dark shape move, in the trees, and then out comes a wolf, and then another shape to the left, and out comes a wolf, and just that experience. I remember that night just like it was yesterday, of these wolves suddenly appearing from all over the place and joining in the middle of the lake, and then just erupting in their chorus of howls. And it wasn't just something I watched; it was something that struck a chord deep within me. And I would say that those type of experiences, that I've had many, have shaped who I am. And as weird as that sounds, even though I'm in the forest, nobody around me but wolves. Um, just that soul inside of me reaching out to wanting to experience and understand and feel, and yeah, at a very young age, I was probably 11 at the time,
Wow.
and those type of experiences have been kind of the bedrock of my development as a person.
Well, that's an experience that I'm willing to say not very many people have
Mhm.
have had,
Yeah,
or
yeah,
that they would embrace it if they did. I mean, the thought of even meeting a wolf would fill
right,
me with absolute terror. We have
right,
coyotes in our neighborhood, and that's enough for me.
yeah, yeah.
And
So
I
it was
have to
just that it was just a unique journey, and I'm, like I
Mhm.
said, looking back, I can't believe I was able to experience the things I did, especially at such a young age, and yet I'm very thankful that I did.
Mhm. I have to ask, this is a really silly question, but as a devout dog lover myself, was your dog with you at the time?
At the time, no, I did not, and the reason I specifically did not bring her along was because when I was a kid, I remember we lived in a super northern British Columbia, just below the Yukon, and
Wow.
we had a big German Shepherd dog named Jason. And I remember the wolves used to come in at night and try to call him out. Like they try to and they would kill dogs.
Right.
And but Jason was huge. I mean, he was a massive German Shepherd. And I remember one night the wolves were kind of able to sucker him out of the yard. Um, and he ended up dying. And so from that stage on, I was like, if anything to do with wolves, I don't want the dog around.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry that happened.
Yeah,
Jeez.
yeah,
Okay, so now here you are, you're growing up. You're 12 years old, 11, 12 years old. You're reading all of these books. Uh, where do you go from there? I mean,
yeah,
what happened that put you on this path that you're on now? I mean,
yeah.
what was that journey like?
Well, if I was to give you kind of a snapshot from 30,000 feet over the years, I would say that that deep hunger to understand why.
Mm,
Um, and it began with um, asking whys about my family situation.
mhm,
Why is my family the way we are? And then about my community and school and schoolmates.
mhm,
And then I remember during the first Iraq War, sitting with my dad around at the kitchen table, listening to it on the radio. Remember, it was
mm,
like And just for hours on end, it was just my dad and I in the dark listening to the radio. And I remember wondering why. What's all this about? Um, so ultimately, I would say my why led me into philosophy. That's
Mhm.
where I would say we were into the C.S. Lewis and then the Platos and the Aristotles and the Confucius and Marcus
Mhm.
Aurelius and on and on. But philosophy really doesn't answer the question why. In fact, really what it does is it teaches us to ask the question why. I would
Mhm.
say more than anything. So ultimately, philosophy led me to psychology and
Mhm.
thinking maybe I could find the answer there. And for a while, I was super into Sigmund Freud,
Mhm.
the id and the ego and the superego and all his theories
Mhm.
around the development of personality. And just to make a long story short, didn't find the answer to why in psychology. Why? Because I don't believe it goes deep enough.
Mm.
And then it took me to neuroscience, and which is a fascinating study. Anyone who's ever studied the human brain, just to think of the neuroplasticity of the brain and literally how our brain can change shape due to trauma or self-control, or
Mhm.
the kind of both ends of the extremes there.
Mhm.
Um, Dopamine, serotonin, I mean, the effects of brain chemicals, just
Mhm.
absolutely amazing stuff. But ultimately, at the end of the day, I'll shorten it and say this: philosophy led me to psychology. Psychology led me to neuroscience. But what I realized was the study of those three fields is really the study of mechanism. It's
Mm.
not the study of source. It doesn't answer the question of what I call the deep why. Not simply the surface why, but the deep why. For that, you have to look, in fact, deeper,
Mhm.
um, into what the ancients always knew to be the core of who we are, and that is our souls.
Mhm.
And it's something that we have forgotten in recent generations, is that we aren't just bodies and brains. We're
Mhm.
three-part beings: body, mind, and soul.
Mhm.
And we live in a culture today that is obsessed over catering to the cravings and the desires of the body and the brain.
Mhm.
But meanwhile, I believe our souls are starving to death. And so
Mm.
ultimately, I look at the world today, and I think we've forgotten what it means to be human.
Mhm.
We've forgotten the essence of what we are. And so my passion, at the moment, especially very strong, is to just remind people of all different backgrounds, um, that more than a brain or a body, you are a soul. And then to try to give definition to that so that we're no longer floundering in the darkness,
Mhm.
wrestling with ambiguous terms that are undefined. My goal has been
Mhm.
to try to bring coherent definition so that we can actually do something about it.
So why don't you try then and give us that definition of a soul? Because
Yeah.
I know the way I was raised, Eastern European,
Mhm.
Byzantine Catholic. So
Yep.
know a lot about, I was taught,
Mhm.
but a lot of people don't, and they don't know really what that means.
Right. Well, I would say that one of the ways I speak to a wide array of audiences, from Christians to atheists, from, you know, um, psychologists to metaphysicists, and I speak
Mhm.
to a lot of different people. So the one of the terms that I tend to use more often, because I think a lot of people find it more comfortable, and that is our non-biological selves.
Mhm.
We have our biological component,
Mhm.
right? I see you, you see me, you hear me, um, and we sometimes get the idea that that is who each other is. But we are so
Mhm.
much more. We have these
Mhm.
biological components, but we also have our non-biological components, and that is the soul. And to be honest, as I mentioned, if you go back into the most ancient of literature, even if, like, let's say you're looking at Homer's The Iliad, one of the most
Mhm.
ancient texts that we know of. There are
Mhm.
others, but they knew clearly that we were three-part beings,
Mhm.
and that our souls were this, in fact, the seat of who we are, the seat of our personhood, the seat of our
Mhm.
personality. Um, but that's something we've forgotten in modern times, and it's not we haven't forgotten it because of some new scientific breakthrough.
Mhm.
We've forgotten it from simply a different trend in thinking.
Mhm.
There's nothing scientific about saying we have no souls. In fact, I would say it's the exact opposite. I would say
Mhm.
it is scientifically proven that we have souls. And
Mhm.
oftentimes the first question I get asked is, what proof do you have of that? What evidence do you have of that? And just to keep things short, I generally I cite two things. I say, first off, we have the internal evidence,
Mhm.
and that is that you are your own best evidence that you have a soul,
Mhm.
right? We intuitively know that we exist beyond biology. And some of the ways we know this is, I'll just quote C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis said that creatures do not have cravings unless
Mhm.
satisfaction for those cravings exists. And it's a very logical, philosophical, even psychological statement, right?
Mhm.
And you'd say, well, a baby feels hunger. Well, there's such a thing as food.
Mhm.
If there were never such a thing as food, we would have never developed the craving of hunger,
Mhm.
right? A duckling hatches from an egg and it wants to swim, right?
Mhm.
There would be no desire to swim if there was no such thing as water,
Mhm.
right? So we don't have cravings unless satisfaction for those cravings exists. We have sexual desire. Well, there's such a thing as sex. Again, if there's no such thing as sex, there'd be no such thing as sexual desire.
Mhm.
But as humanity, we have deeper cravings that aren't just biological cravings. We have what I call soul cravings.
Mhm.
We crave the distinction between a moral right and a moral wrong,
Mhm.
right? That is not a biological craving. That goes deeper. We crave identity. We're the only creature on earth that you can give us all the money in the world, big fancy house, big
Mhm.
fancy job, but if we don't know who we are, we don't have peace. In fact, not only do we do not have peace, we often have the opposite of peace.
Mhm.
We crave identity. Again, that's not a biological craving. And then beyond that, we crave the eternal. We crave, I would even say, God.
Mhm.
Those cravings would not exist unless satisfaction for those cravings also exist. So in that
Mhm.
basic sense of there's the personal internal evidence of the soul. But then there's the historic evidence, or what I would call the evidence of universal and uncoerced conclusion. And that is to say that every culture on earth that we have ever been aware of and documented came to the same conclusion. That it is a fascinating thing to think of this. The awareness of the soul did not travel across the globe like religion did, or
Mhm.
like gunpowder did, right? So
Mhm.
from what I understood, is somewhere in ancient China, they invented gunpowder, and then someone visited, and they saw that, and they took that with them to India,
Mhm.
and then someone saw that, they took it with them to Europe. The knowledge of the soul did not spread like that. That's the way different religions have spread. When Put it this way, when the Europeans, landed at Plymouth Rock, they
Mhm.
brought religion with them,
Mhm.
but they did not bring the soul. They had an understanding and awareness of the soul, but they came to a people who already had an awareness of the soul and had already formed a religious structure to try to explain it. The Romans believed in the soul. And when the Romans landed their ships, north of the White Cliffs of Dover in Britain, they believed in the soul, but they came to a people who already believed in the soul. They did not bring
Mhm.
that awareness, right? Long before Africa was ever subject to outside influence or conquest,
Mhm.
um, they believed in the soul. So when you think that every culture, without coercion,
Mhm.
came to the same conclusion, I mean that is a scientific, and that's the very definition of science in that
Mhm.
regard. And so yeah, I mean we have souls. We know it internally. We have historical evidence of it all around us. And so your soul, to get back to your original question, sorry for
Mhm.
ranting,
No, that was good.
it's your non-biological self. It is the core of who you are. It is the seat of your personality. It is the seat of your motivation. The deepest decisions you make in life, the deepest cravings you have in life do not originate in the body or the brain.
Mhm.
They are rooted deeper inside of us. And as long as we are pursuing happiness or wholeness, as long as we are even getting quote unquote, mentally healthy, but we are keeping it skin or brain deep,
Mhm.
we're not going deep enough. We're not scratching that true itch that is deep down inside of us.
Then that leads me to another question. Can your soul ever be wrong?
Yeah.
If you're
Oh,
listening to your soul and you're paying attention to it, I mean, I have my own opinion on that answer,
yeah.
but I would
Yeah.
just like to hear yours.
Yeah. What a great question. I don't think I've ever been asked that question before, but I think the answer is profound because
Mhm.
and this is where I think again I would say that almost every religion talks about this to some degree, but even in philosophy and in
Mhm.
psychology, it's rooted. So as you mentioned in my book, I talk about the five cravings of the soul.
Mhm.
And so I've identified what I believe to be our five core motivators. They are the source of all human ambition and all human desire. You can understand everything that's happening in the world by understanding these five cravings that are inside of you and inside every other human being who's ever existed, regardless of their race or creed. But, and we could talk about that in a minute if you want. So you have these five cravings which propel us towards goodness or evil, depending on which way
Mhm.
we direct them. It all depends
Mhm.
on which way we direct these cravings, right? It's kind of like, am I going to eat a nice healthy steak and veggies tonight, right? Or am I going to eat, chips and Pepsi,
Mhm.
for supper, right? It's like one's healthy and one's get helpful and one's not. Um, but I believe so in philosophy, in I would say in religious circles or spiritual circles, one of the words that we would use is sin.
Mhm.
But in philosophical or psychological circles, they call it the final fantastic element. And that is to say this, that again, going back to things philosophically, it has been, I believe, proven throughout time. If you give humanity something beautiful, we will enjoy it for a while, and then we
Mm.
will inevitably destroy it. And there is inside of this compulsion to what's the word, to taint things, to mess things up, to manage them to a point where they lose their beauty or even their purpose.
Mm.
And so I believe my personal way I would put it is I would say that we all have tainted souls. Right. And that is why, there's that old in the Christian worldview, there's the old myth in it of the idea of an angel sitting on one shoulder and the devil sitting on the other, right?
Mhm.
Whispering in your ear, which decision are you going to make, right? And as much as that's kind of obviously a silly analogy, I do believe that there is within us this pull to pursue these cravings inside of us in the right direction, or to pursue them in a way that brings harm and hurt to the world around us. And I think that, to be honest, one of the reasons we see the chaos in the world today is because a lot of us are pursuing the cravings of the soul in the wrong direction.
Mhm. So do you think that that's like an internal battle kind of
Yeah.
going on inside of us all the time, or people who are a little bit more aware of, the power of good and evil, that you
Hmm.
can go either way.
Yeah.
You can choose that steak or you can choose the McDonald's, but
Yeah.
that I'm not even really sure where I'm going with this question, but
Yeah.
if you are more aware that there is that possibility of you can make that wrong turn and go down the wrong road of what, let's just call it evil versus good. I mean,
Yeah.
do you believe that that's a possibility in all of us? And let's just go back to, Adam and Eve and the apple.
Yeah. I don't really believe it's a possibility in all of us. I think it is the reality that takes place in all of us.
Mm,
And whether or not, again, you use the word sin or a more philosophical term of the fatal fantastic element,
mhm,
um, I believe that it is something that um, again, if you look at the world around us and you look at the people around us, and throughout all of history, we have to say that mankind has a tendency to pursue self-destruction.
mm,
And and I would say that that is related to that tainted aspect of our soul. But just to kind of go back what you touched on earlier, I do believe that awareness changes everything. And
mhm,
that's why I'm so interested in talking to, I mean, I come from a faith background. But when I talk on all the different shows that I talk on, I rarely talk about my faith unless people are interested in talking about my faith. What I want
mhm,
to talk about are those places where we intersect, where those
mhm,
places where we can come to agreement on what's true about all of us.
mhm,
And that's why I love talking about the soul, because regardless of where you come from, you have a soul.
mhm,
Your soul is looking for these five things,
mhm,
but your soul is also tainted and has a tendency to lead you in the wrong direction.
mm,
Um, and I believe that that's true of all of us, again, regardless of your culture, your ethnicity,
mhm,
your faith background, your worldview.
mhm. I'm really curious as well. Is there a correlation between like soul and intuition?
Yeah, well, I would say that the, the reason that I am so excited to share with people the five cravings of their soul
Mhm,
is to bring clarity to, I don't want to say to the confusion, but to bring simplicity to what we've made really complicated. So much
mhm,
of life we've blown up Occam's razor, right? And we've pursued all these complicated options, so to
mhm,
speak. And so I would say, for an example, and that when we talk about, the Olympics is coming up in Paris this year. I love the Olympics, right? And we all know there's going to be so many, heart wrenching, we're going to cry, of all these beautiful music ridden,
mhm,
monologues where they talk about the triumph of the human spirit. We're going to hear that phrase over and over again. We're talking about the soul.
mhm,
When you say to someone, follow your heart, they're talking about the soul. In
mhm,
fact, if you go back into the Greek, um, the word heart and soul are they both specifically mean the seat of who you are.
mhm,
They're symbiotic. We're referencing maybe different aspects of our non-biological selves, but we're
mhm,
talking about the soul. I would personally even say, and I know some people have a different perspective, and I'm very cool with different perspectives, that for me, when we talk about the spirit versus the soul. Sometimes I think for some people it's a helpful distinction, but for me, I believe when we talk about the spirit, we're simply talking about what I might call the healthy soul or the restored part of our soul. And but ultimately, we're talking about our non-biological selves.
mhm.
And we don't have two non-biological selves. We have one biological self, but we're using all sorts of terms when we talk about things, even in psychology. We're talking about the subconscious mind
Mhm.
or things like that. If you actually question, deep psychiatry or psychiatrists, you will find that they really don't know what they're talking about when they talk about the subconscious mind. They're just saying, okay, there's something there. We don't know what it is. Oh, it's the soul, is what I believe. When you talk about intuition as well, I think that it is that soul alertness, right? Your soul is telling you something that your brain hasn't yet figured out to tell you,
Mhm.
right? And so, sorry, again, long answer to your question, but I do think the two are linked.
Well, thank you. And no, no such thing as a long answer. I
Thank you.
love this conversation. I love the direction that it's going. And even, talking about spirit, because I first really started delving into that when I began my martial arts training, and that was 20 years ago, over 20 years ago. And they would always talk about, and of course, I did not start my training willingly. It's a very long story. I was dragged kicking on and screaming, and not in a good way, onto the mat, going, I'm not going to do this, and then fell in love with it. But he would always talk, our sensei would always talk about training our spirit,
Mhm.
and that's one of the things that we're doing. We weren't just training our bodies and, training our minds, but we were actually training our spirit and growing our spirit. And I never really knew what he was talking about until I could start to feel it in myself. And it's something that's really hard to explain. It's not just that sense of confidence that,
Mhm.
you're gaining through training, but there was just a sense of clarity
Yeah.
and awareness, not only, in the outside world, but even in myself, parts that I hadn't paid attention to before, due to, for various reasons.
Yeah. Well, and I would say that you're exactly right. And I would say that in a similar sense, that's what happens. That's what happened to me when I was a little boy on that hill, on that
Hmm.
watching those wolves. It's what happens to many of us if we watch a beautiful sunset,
Hmm.
as we know there's something deeper happening here. There's some deeper feeling taking place here than just a neuron firing in my brain, right?
Right.
There is a there's something within me that is responding that I can feel. Yeah.
Hmm. So I have got to ask you, when did you decide to write the book?
Well, it really came from I guess the word I would say was a word I would use is revelation. The word, I don't know if you've ever had those moments where you're thinking about something and suddenly it all comes together.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say that kind of in a existential, holistic, sense that I had that experience where when I talk about this book, I often will say, and again, to that martial arts kind of feeling that you mentioned, I would say that I couldn't not write it.
Mm-hmm.
I felt like it was one of those things where there was just in me this drive. This has to be documented. This has to be written down.
Hmm.
Um, and the one thing that I'll say is and for anyone who's interested in the book, is there's no book to compare it to,
Mhm.
in the sense that I am writing about things that are on in one sense are brand new. People will be
Mhm.
like, I've never looked at the world this way before. But on another sense, you'll be like, I've known this all along.
Mhm.
Only now it's verbalized and it's like it feels like home. Like I this is reality. And so I guess in that sense, that would be what really compelled me was just the sense that this has to be written.
Mhm.
And it was 4 years of writing and rewriting and then researching and then erasing and rewriting and then I remember when 6 months kind of before I was done, I thought I was done, and I sent it out to several different people I knew throughout different walks of life, from theologians to um, psychologists to truck drivers.
Mm.
Specifically wanted to go to a wide variety of people, and they all came back with the same thing. They said, "Love the content, but it reads like a thesis." And
Oh.
so I went back and I rewrote it all. I was like, I don't want it to read like a thesis. I want it to be like butter. I want it to go down like butter. And so I rewrote it so that it's much more palatable for anybody who wants to read it.
Well, that typically explains a lot of first time,
Mhm.
authors and the
Yeah.
first manuscript or the first version of it. I had to laugh because I was at an author's event right before Christmas. It was a festival, and this young police officer walked in. So he worked at the town, and he was talking to a couple of other authors, and he was talking about his book, and he wrote his book, and he was so proud of his book and his first thing. And then he realized though that something just wasn't sitting well with him, and it
Mhm.
wasn't until he was finished with the book and he went back and went over it again, he is like, "Oh my goodness, this reads like a report, like a
Yeah.
police report," because that's what he knew. And
Yeah.
even with my first book, I had to rewrite it because it just sounded like I was doing patient notes, and
Yeah.
charting. And yeah, so you have to you have to step away from it and if you don't mind me saying, put your soul into it and put your
Yeah.
personality into it.
Very true. And I've had several people who have read it who've got back to me and said, um, I can tell that you grew up reading the classics, because just pours out of me. I write in that classical
Right.
style, right? And it was very interesting. One of the exciting things for me too is, so right when I was kind of felt like I wasn't going to write anymore, who am I like to write this? And I was in Berkeley University with a man named Os Guinness,
Mhm.
who's he's a theologian, he's a apologist, he's a philosopher, political pundit. Um, and I was wandering the halls of Berkeley with Os Guinness and just kind of telling him what I was doing. He's a brilliant mind, absolutely brilliant mind. And he's like, Cory, you gotta write this book. Cory, you gotta write this book. And then that kind of what really drove me towards it. And so I'm excited because I feel like it's one of these things where I'm working on several other versions now. My
Mhm.
original version, it really walks the parallel lines of philosophy, psychology,
Mhm.
faith, theology, those
Mhm.
type things. Definitely, I will reach oftentimes faith-based conclusions throughout the book. I'm
Mhm.
working on a more psychological version of it as well, and I'm working on a couple different a parenting version, understanding the soul in kids and stuff
Oh,
like
that'd
that.
be
So
good.
several different versions, so that everybody feels like it reflects them.
Mhm. All right. So, and I wrote it down, faith and theology, because I know you talk to a lot of people.
Mhm,
And, I don't know if there is faith and theology in this book,
mhm,
but I mean, how do you differentiate the two? Or how do you even, considering what you do and
mhm.
your experiences, is it even possible to separate the two, the theology and faith?
Right. Well, that is a great question. I love the questions you're asking. I would say, so the theologian in me would say that there's that the it's a symbiotic relationship, in that true faith is defined um by correctly hermeneutically understanding the ancient
Mhm.
texts, right? And so, but in that same sense, the scripture also says, the letter kills, but the spirit gives life, right? And so the idea of faith transcending simply a dry reading of the text, right, but a living reading of the text. And so I would say that that is so. In particularly in my book, I I explore what it means to be made in the image of God,
Mhm.
right? And the book is called The Magnetic Heart of God, Understanding the
Mhm.
Five Cravings of Your Soul, right? And so understanding that these cravings are within each one of us and they are looking for a specific thing, but you cannot satisfy, at the end of the day, let me put it this way, you cannot satisfy non-biological craving with biological things, which sadly is what much of the world is trying to do right now, right? You have to feed non-biological cravings, non-biological nourishment. And so specifically in my book, generally oftentimes the first half of the chapters are looking at us from a behaviorist,
Mhm.
psychologist, existential type point of view. And then the last, quarter of the chapter or one third of the chapter would be saying, okay, how does this relate to the scriptures?
Mhm.
Are the script is theology and philosophy merging here, or is there a contrast?
Mhm.
And trying to bring a distinction to that.
Do you think that that's one of the reasons why there is so much chaos, if you
Mhm.
will, and mental illness in the world? Because
Yeah,
I never in my life, I'm 67 years old, have never seen so much mental illness and
yeah,
so many problems. And that could be because of the disconnect between people wanting to fulfill a non
mhm,
biological craving
yeah.
with a biological result.
Yeah, in fact, I would say so. I am a huge proponent, and I'm very thankful that the world is finally taking seriously mental health issues and mental health aspects.
Hmm.
However, at the same time, I would say sometimes we categorize things as mental health issues when they're deeper than that. They're soul issues. So let me just
Hmm.
put it this way. Think of this for a moment. It's quite amazing. We live in a time of unprecedented prosperity.
Hmm.
The generations that are alive today have more than
Hmm.
any other generation in the history of the world. We have more access to wealth opportunity, to freedoms, to
Hmm.
comfort, leisure, entertainment, education, world travel, on and on and on. And yet, virtually every study shows that we are more unhappy than ever. As you mentioned, all these mental health issues, we are more discouraged, we are more confused. I remember 10 or 15 years ago, there was this big push politically, which then became a push socially towards education.
Mhm.
Don't get me wrong, I'm a fan of education, but the idea was education is going to solve all the world's problems. If we would all just get educated, and really what people were saying is if you would just think like me, we could all get along. But there was this huge push towards education. And now, like, as I mentioned, we have more opportunity, more access through technology to education than any other. We're more confused than ever. And under the surface, there's this, I can't put it any other way than like a bubbling rage. There's a
Mhm.
tension. And all of this, despite the fact that we have more than any other generation in the history of mankind. And you have to say, how is this possible? And ultimately, I believe, just kind of as you mentioned, that it's because we have been pursuing the cravings of the body and the brain. It's
Mhm.
our cultural obsession, the body, the brain, the body, the brain. Every politician that makes a promise, it's towards the body and the brain, right? Every commercial on TV, the body and the brain. Everything you scroll through on social media designed to activate the body and the brain. Meanwhile, our souls, the core of who we are, is starving to death.
Mhm.
And that is why we are confused. That is why we are angry. That is why there is this desperation, despite the fact that we have more than anyone else in history.
Mhm. Well, I would go a step further, say not, why we're so angry. You said it before, rage. I mean, there
Yeah.
is this incredible boiling rage. And just driving down the street, you can see it.
Yeah.
Everybody
Yeah.
is just so angry and so triggered.
Yeah.
And it doesn't take much for, a simple trip to the grocery store to, wind up in, yeah, a
Yeah.
violent mess.
Yeah.
So especially for people who are listening to this that still might have that little question mark about the soul. It's like, is this really what he's talking about? How do people reconnect with their soul? How do they come to get to know it better? How can they nurture it? Much
Yeah.
in the way that I was nurturing my spirit and growing it in
Yeah.
martial arts. How can, especially if they have that little bit of doubt.
Yeah. Well, let me describe it this way. It's not enough to say you have a soul because it's like, okay, well, what do I do with that? Right.
Right.
Um, I want to go back to cravings for a moment and say we all have souls and our souls are looking for something. In fact, they're looking for the same things. And so I believe you can understand yourself.
Mhm.
Um, you can understand the people around you when you understand these cravings. I'll just give them to you quickly. Of course, I go into great detail in the book, but I'll say them quickly and then I'll break them apart. You are looking for, in everything you do,
Mhm.
from your pursuit of marriage or divorce, education or career, you are looking for, not just psychologically, not biologically, in your soul, security, identity, independence, significance, and innocence.
Mm.
I believe that all human movement can be understood by understanding these five cravings. Security, as an example, I break it into two parts. There's physical security, which of course we would call our will to survive, right? Our
Mhm.
survival instinct.
Mhm.
But we don't just have a survival instinct. We also have this desire to be relationally secure.
Mhm.
And that is to say, all of us, every human on earth needs to know that their hearts are safe in the hands of those who hold them.
Mm.
And you can have all the physical security in the world, but if you don't have relational security, you don't have peace. It's not possible. And so security is more than physical. In fact, there are, I, I've heard several people, even psychologists, suggest that your survival instinct is the greatest of all human instincts. I would argue with that. I would say there are many people who have willingly thrown away their physical security in order to try to either maintain or attain relational security.
Wow.
It is so powerful within us. Second, identity. I
Mhm.
often will say identity asks four symbiotic questions. Who am I? Why am I? Do I have value? Do I have purpose?
Mhm.
And you can have all the security in the world live in a castle with a moat around you,
Mhm.
um, and have, a family surrounding you that loves you. But if you don't know who you are, or if there's value or purpose to your existence, you do not have peace, period. And we have a major identity crisis happening in the world today,
Mhm.
partly because we've been doing such a terrible job. We've been doing a good job doing a terrible thing, and that is tearing down so many of our identity structures. And
Mhm.
now so many people are wondering, where can I find identity? Right? Security, identity, independence. I break independence into two parts. There is the freedom aspect, in the
Mhm.
sense that there is, as William Wallace said, you may take our lives, but you will never take our freedom.
Mhm.
But again, listen to that. Willing to throw away their physical security in order to gain freedom, independence, right?
Mhm.
We need to know that we are autonomous in some way.
Mhm.
That's why prison itself is a punishment.
Mhm.
You confine someone, you take away their freedom, and it is so stressful on us as human beings that it's actually punishment. But it's not just the desire for freedom, it's our desire to be individuals. So independence is freedom and individualism.
Mhm.
I need to know that I'm distinct. If I don't feel like I'm distinct, then I feel like I'm redundant and unnecessary. And this is even true of all those identical twins. The ones who
Mhm.
for a while they want to have the matching shirts and the matching haircuts, and
Yeah.
you don't know who's who. At some point, they will all come to the point where they need something that sets them apart as distinct, right? Maybe they're the
Mhm.
academic twin, or they're the twin that loves Star Wars, or whatever it is, right? We all need something inside of us that is distinct. And then we come to significance. We're not just craving distinction. We crave to be special,
Mhm.
not just set us apart, but set above. There is within us this desire to feel like we are special in some way. And for some people, um, the way that they grew up, the way they pursue this is they need to have the biggest biceps of anyone else, you know, and that's how they pursue their significance. For someone else, it's academically. How many PhDs do you have? And what was your grade point average? They ask these, and we judge the world around us on biceps and diplomas, right? Or whatever it is, right? We have these mechanisms. We're all pursuing the same thing. It's significance.
Mhm.
right? But due to our different environments of growing up, we're pursuing them in different directions.
Mhm.
And then fifth and finally, but last but not least, is is innocence.
Mm.
We are all craving innocence. And that is to say, we are all craving to believe this inner sense that we are good boys and girls. No, and the it kind of has two sides to the coin. It's not just that we're craving, we don't want, it's not enough to know that we're not guilty. We want to feel so innocent that we are in fact righteous.
Mm.
And when you look at the world around you today, this is huge. When you think of cancel culture,
Mhm.
um, or I'll generally put it this way. Think of this. Basically, every argument you've ever had or any offense you've ever taken
Mhm.
happened because you perceived, whether you perceived rightly or wrongly, doesn't matter. You perceived that someone was accusing you of
Mhm.
wrongdoing or wrong thinking. And we can't be around someone like that. And so generally what we do is we either have to run away because I can't be around someone who triggers me in the innocence place and in the
Mhm.
innocence point, or we enter into what I call the righteousness wars. Right. You say to me, Cheryl, Cory, you left your socks on the floor again.
Mhm.
Right. And what I should do is be like, you're right. I shouldn't have done that. I apologize. Right. But we've all felt that there's that thing that rises up inside of
Right.
us, right? It's like, oh yeah, well, you left the kitchen a mess.
Mhm.
And the
Yep.
innocence wars. Who's the most innocent? Right. And that's also why it's so hard in today's world, or just throughout all human history, to admit when we're wrong.
Mhm.
Because we're essentially saying, I if I'm wrong, I'm either not significant or I'm guilty in a sense. That's the default mode which we view it. And so it is very hard for us to admit wrongdoing, even when we are clearly wrong,
Mhm.
because it is so hard for us to admit that we're guilty or that, we thought we were right, but we were wrong. So when you look at the world around you, from everyone from Genghis Khan, right, to you and I,
Mhm.
there's all sorts of complicated social environments. And we could even say that there are like psychological or medical diagnoses to be given. But at the root of all of them, at the basis of all human movement, has been the pursuit, both in healthy directions and in very unhealthy directions, of security, identity, independence, significance, and innocence. I would say, welcome to your soul.
Mhm.
That is what your soul is looking for. And it's deeper than psychology. It
Mhm.
exists at the very core of who you are. And once you understand yourself in this way, it really does change everything.
Mhm.
Um, because you understand why you do what you say, why does someone want to get married or get into a long-term relationship? Well, they're looking for security, physical and
Mhm.
relational, right? They're looking for a place where they can identify.
Mhm.
In psychology, we call it ideum. It's that collective identity to a certain
Mhm.
degree. It's the two of us against the world in every
Mhm.
romantic novel ever
Mhm.
made, right? Someplace that doesn't infringe too much on our freedom,
Mhm.
because someplace that makes us feel significant.
Mhm.
We're special. You are the most beautiful woman. You are the most intelligent man. We feel significant in that relationship. And a place that makes us feel innocent. You're a good person and I love you unconditionally.
Mhm.
Why do we get divorced? Because we didn't find it, right?
Mhm.
And I would argue that these are non-biological cravings, so we can't find them in each other. They weren't designed to be satisfied in temporal things. And I think
Mhm.
they were designed to be satisfied in some place. That's why they call the book The Magnetic Heart of God.
Mhm.
And I'm happy with people. For myself, just full transparency, I come from a Christian worldview, but I would tell people from any background, whatever it is, unless you are connecting with some sense of the divine, some sense of something much larger, you will always feel like there is something missing and empty
Mhm.
inside. And so those are the five cravings of our soul. And the beautiful part of it is I can now look at you and I don't know you, Cheryl. I just met you, right?
Mhm.
But I know what you're looking for.
Mhm.
And now that because I know what you're looking for, I know how to love you.
Mhm.
I know how to support you. I know how to be a cheerleader for you.
Mhm.
And you know how to do that for me now.
Mhm.
And so when we look at the world around us, we can look at our favorite politician and the politician we hate, right? Or whatever it is, and we can say, you know what? I understand them a little bit more.
Mhm.
They're looking for the same things I am. They just happen to be looking in a different direction. And it
Mhm.
gives me the opportunity to love them or to have compassion on them, to somehow come to a point of unity that isn't possible if we're only looking at each other through biological eyes.
Mhm.
And suddenly we're dividing over hair colors and skin colors and academic backgrounds and cultural
Mhm.
practices and all these
Mhm.
things. When we look deeper and we understand that you are a soul, a precious, valuable soul,
Mhm.
and you're looking for the same things I am,
Mhm.
that is our greatest opportunity for unity yet.
Well, I cannot wait to read your book. I've got it in my cart already. I did that this morning, but I just can't wait to read it. And especially since you mentioned politics or politicians, I'm going to go
Yeah,
back a little bit, a ways back when you were talking about the breaking down of identity structures.
yeah,
And it's something that I probably wouldn't have put it exactly in those words, but something that I had been noticing, especially recently, about how we are being divided and these structures are being just challenged and broken down and we're being separated. I'm a suspicious person and I'm very honest about that. To me, it almost seems like it's by design.
I think it's by definitely sub subconscious soul in that sense.
Mm, okay.
Design. I mean, I think the problem with politics, as you mentioned, you mentioned the word, is because politics is no longer about the issues. It's no
Right.
longer about having a dialogue over which direction we think. Politics has become about identity. And
Mm,
oh, politics becomes dangerous and, to be perfectly honest, somewhat useless now that it's
hmm.
become about identity. Because now we can't have a conversation,
No.
because I'm no longer, I often will say this, when you truly find your identity, identity feels like home,
Hmm.
and you will fight to protect your home.
Hmm.
So we have to be very careful about what things we allow in our lives to become identities, as opposed to just preferences,
Hmm.
right? But because politics has become about identity, dialogue no longer works,
Hmm.
because any conversation is you invading my home or me invading your
Right.
home. So until we can say, you know what, regardless of what my parents taught me or my grandparents taught me, I am going to no longer allow politics to be a source of identity in my life. I may have voted Republican or I may have voted Democrat, but I will not allow that to become my identity.
Hmm.
But I think we have. I think most people have. And that's why it is so partisan now today in that
Hmm.
sense. We can't even have a conversation anymore. And that's scary because when you can no longer have a conversation, worse things follow.
Right. Well, and it's toxic.
Yeah.
I hate to use that word because it
Yeah.
is, I think, overused, but it
Mm.
creates a really toxic situation, and
Yeah.
then we can't talk to each other, and
Yeah.
that gap just gets wider and
Yeah.
wider, and
Right.
nothing good comes out of
Yeah.
that.
But even think of the politicians or TV commercials for that matter. They aren't aware of the craving of their souls yet, but they're doing this intuitively. What are they? It's like they're no longer trying to sell you a credit card.
Right.
They're saying, become part of the platinum club. They're trying to sell you an identity, right?
Right.
And that's a big thing. And the same thing with politics. It's become about identity, but it's always about, you know, if you don't vote for me, you won't be secure.
Hmm. Hmm.
Or more often than if you vote for that guy, you're guilty
Hmm.
because that you can't be righteous and vote for that guy. You have to vote with me or you're not righteous.
Hmm.
Right? They all come into play, right? And don't vote for that person. They'll take away your freedom. Or on and on it goes, right? It's they're salespeople. I have talked to a number of salespeople about the soul, and I'm always trying to I've always, to be honest, felt an inner kind of turmoil about it because I don't want to give them tools that they will use to abuse others. But ultimately, that's what they're already doing, right? There's no such thing as a product anymore. They're trying
Mhm.
to sell you significance. They're trying
Mhm.
to sell you security. They're trying to sell you identity, right? And it's very, very clever.
Well, basically, you are the product.
Yeah, yeah,
So, Cory, how can people get a hold of you? Where can they find you? Where can they get your book? Tell us a little bit more about your coaching, your teaching. Just I know we're
sure.
kind of getting close to the
Yeah.
end of an hour here, so.
Well, thank you. Yeah, the most central place to find me would be at coryrosenke.com, where you can learn a little bit more about me. I have under the book section there, I have posted a few links to kind of the most popular places that people like to order from. But
Mhm.
ultimately, if you just search the Magnetic Heart of God,
Mhm.
understanding the five, it'll come up at a place near you. It's available everywhere and worldwide. Um, and I don't know if it's sad. I don't call it sad. It's just the way the world has evolved in this sense. But 90% of books are bought online. They're not
Mhm.
bought in the store anymore. And so
Mhm.
that's, on one hand, that's a bummer. On the other hand, it makes it's accessible to everybody, right? So
Right.
the book is available near you. If you just type it in to your browser there, it should show up nearby. On my website as well, there's a way to contact me if anyone is interested in coaching. Um, I do transformational coaching is what I call it.
Mhm.
Sometimes people are looking to transform their lives in some way. Maybe they want to climb the corporate ladder. Some people, I have clients that are in university, trying to finish strong their academic year. I have people who are struggling in relationships,
Mhm.
that want to grow, who want to transform. And
Mhm.
one radio um, host kind of dubbed me the soul coach at one time a little while ago. I was like, oh, that's interesting because I talk about the soul also in coaching because I don't want to just coach you, though I am trained in what we call like neuroscience-based coaching.
Mhm.
Ultimately, I want to help people answer these deep questions inside. So I'd
Mhm.
be happy to help anyone who's interested.
Mhm. Excellent. Oh, thank you so much for being on the show. This has been a great conversation. I've absolutely loved it, and I cannot wait to read your book. Which brings me to another question before we sign off. There is another one,
There's
and
more in the works.
more
Yes,
in the
yes,
works?
ma'am.
Yeah.
I'm planning right now. The publisher has asked for it, and I'm working on it. It was to a certain degree. Remember when those series came out, the Chicken Soup for the Soul,
Yes.
and it was so popular. And even though they didn't define soul the way I think they should have defined it, anyway, there was all these spin-offs of it, right?
Right.
Chicken
Right.
Soup for the Soul in the workplace, Chicken Soup for the
Yeah.
Soul, and all these. Similarly, I'm working on a similar thing because my first one walks those, like I said, those parallel lines between philosophy
Mhm.
and um, and theology, and the second one is going to kind of focus more pointedly on philosophy and psychology, and then more down the pipe from there as well.
Okay, well, when your next one is published, would you please contact me? We'll have you on the show again. You can talk about that, and we'll have another fantastic conversation if that's okay with you.
I would love that. Thanks so much for your time, Cheryl. I appreciate you giving me the opportunity.
Before we sign off, one more thing. Do you have one final little pearl of wisdom that you would like to leave with the listeners?
Absolutely. I would encourage you to remember that you are more than the reflection looking back at you in the mirror. You're more than the number on the weigh scale. You're more than the balance in your bank account or the diploma hanging on your wall. You are a soul of intrinsic value. And when you start living your life to feed your soul and to nourish your soul, when you become aware of what you're looking for, security, identity, independence, significance, innocence, now that you can name it, now
Mhm.
that you're not just using ambiguous terms like happiness or
Mhm.
peace or something like that, now you can define happiness and peace, security, identity, independence, significance, innocence. Now you actually have a chance to finding it. And I would just encourage you to go look, and I just wish you well on your journey.
Excellent. Thank you again for being on the show, Cory. This has been awesome.
Thank you, ma'am.
And everybody, thank you so much for listening. Please share this episode with everyone you know. A lot of really gold nuggets in this episode, and getting us to think a little bit differently about ourselves and about each other, and how we can help make this world a better place. Maybe a little bit with more awareness and living through our soul and feeding our soul instead of our brain and our body. And that is the way of the FemiNinja.